Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to lecture 14, and this is obviously the final lecture before we all disappear for reading week, and you get to do lots of reading for a few days. And as you can see, the topic for today's lecture is on the role of religion in education systems. This is something that touches on a number of themes that we've been discussing in the module. It intersects very closely, for instance, with debates around secularism, secularization, of course, religious freedoms, which we were talking about last week, feature prominently in these debates as well. And it's an extremely significant topic because religious organisations have historically been the main providers of education and continue to play this role in many parts of the world. So the plan for this lecture is as follows. I'm going to start off by giving you a very, very brief review of the historical context around the links between religion and education. Then I'm going to look at some of the rest of it's really straightforward. Then I'm going to look at some of the main criticisms of involving religion in the education system. Then I'm going to look at some arguments in favour of religion in the education system, and then I'm going to conclude by a bit of an assessment at the end and just kind of going over some of the main points there and trying to wrap things up. One important thing to note before we begin, however, is that there's no necessary link between any of these arguments and religious beliefs. Sometimes people get the view that if you are opposed to faith schools, then that means that you are anti-religious in some way. And that, conversely, if you're religious, you must therefore be pro-faith schools, right? That doesn't work at all. Those connections are just completely spurious. It's entirely possible, for example, to be a die-hard atheist and to think that religious schools are fine. You might take the view that you like ideas of personal choice, and that if people want to send their children to religious schools, that is their free choice, and although you personally wouldn't approve of them, it's none of your business, right? That's a perfectly feasible intellectual position to hold. And on the other side, it's also possible to be religious, as I say, and dislike faith schools. The Fair Admissions Campaign, for example, which is one of the leading organisations opposing faith schools in the UK, although they have in recent years moved away from the faith schools emphasis, and they're now much more of a general organisation. So they oppose things like grammar schools and selection in all manner of forms. But when they began, one of their main strands was opposing faith schools, and they were supported in this by a range of religious groups. So British Muslims for Secular Democracy, for example, the Hindu Academy was a big supporter. The General Assembly of Unitarian and Free Christian Churches was on the list as well, amongst others, right? So just the first thing to kind of get on the board here is that there's no necessary connection between being a supporter of a faith school or a critic of a faith school and being for or against religion. That connection just doesn't work. So we begin properly then, with that out of the way, with, as I said, a very, very scandalously brief, in fact, potted review of the link between religion and education in history. And the general theme here is that religion and education have had, historically, very close links. In the ancient world, for instance, education was often linked to religious institutions. Temple schools, for example, were the prominent organisation here, and priests were the main educators in those societies. There were a few, it's worth noting, secular educational institutions during this time, the most famous of which, as I'm sure you all recognise from this slide, being that you are the direct intellectual descendants of this. This is, of course, the Academy, which was founded in ancient Greece by Plato in the 4th century BCE. So, there were a couple of them hanging around, but the vast majority of educational organisations were religiously based. After the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, the church became the leading promoter of education in Europe. And the first universities, as you can see here on the left, this is Bologna, which was founded in the 11th century. Paris and Oxford, founded in the 12th century. If anyone's ever been around Oxford University, you could be forgiven for thinking that it hasn't really moved on from the 12th century very much. But anyway, these were the earliest universities that were established in Europe, had very, very close links to the church, and laid the groundwork for the modern university system, teaching both religious and secular topics. The situation in the Muslim world was very similar, with religious schools known as madrasas being the primary sources of education. There's a couple of interesting side notes just to make here, by the way. The first, which is, I think, interesting in light of last week's lecture on sex and gender and religion, is that the oldest university in the world, now, there is some debate about this. This is the one on the right, by the way. There is some debate about this. Some people argue that it was, in fact, a university. Others argue that it was a mosque and that it had a school bits attached to it. So, there is a debate around that, but let's give it the benefit of the doubt, because I think it just makes the story more interesting. The first university in the world was founded in Morocco in the 10th century by a Muslim woman named Fatima al-Fihri. So that's the first sort of mildly interesting factoid along this little historical review. The second one is that these religious institutions had a profound impact on the development of European civilization as a whole. And one of the interesting things here, right, is when the Roman Empire collapsed and European society became increasingly fragmented, lots of the old philosophical texts and philosophical teachings and speculations and thoughts and everything else from the ancient world, all the teachings of Plato and Aristotle and all that crew, most of them were lost. And became destroyed or just dispersed, or people sort of threw them away, had no need for them anymore. And the ancient philosophical texts were, for all intents and purposes, lost largely to European civilization and to European history. However, many of these texts found their way into the Muslim world, and they were translated by religious scholars. Particularly, they really had a fondness for Aristotle. And they were translated by Muslim scholars, and then they were preserved in centres of learning, like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, for example. And then they were kind of put into storage, right? So these ideas weren't lost to human history. They were lost to European civilization, preserved in the Muslim world. And then when the inter-civilizational contacts between the Muslim world and the Christian world started to get going from the sort of 12th to 13th century, these texts were then rediscovered by European thinkers and European philosophers, and then they became translated back again into European languages, and these ideas, these ancient philosophical ideas, became re-imported back into Europe and played a key role in the Renaissance and ultimately the Enlightenment of the 17th century. So the Muslim world has, I just think this is quite a nice, interesting sidebar to the development of world civilization, right? It wouldn't have happened in the way that it did if it wasn't for Muslim scholars preserving these ideas, and largely that was to do with religious thinkers and religious institutions. And then finally, the Protestant Reformation, as a point we've sort of mentioned before, also played a significant role in shaping education. As we know, or as we should know, because we've mentioned it a few times, Protestants placed great emphasis on literacy, because the whole point of Protestantism was you had to read the Bible for yourself, you had to interpret it for yourself, you had to have this personal relationship with God rather than having teachings being translated and transmitted through a separate religious institutions. And so this then led to an expansion of Protestant schools. And because we had an expansion of Protestant schools, This then prompted the Catholic Church to start promoting Catholic schools, and so we end up with a proliferation of religious schools in Europe from this time period. Nevertheless, it's not until we get to the Enlightenment, and especially the rise of the nation-state during the 19th century, that we start to see a separation of religion and education. The Enlightenment, on the one hand, challenges the Church's monopoly on knowledge and starts to promote secular and rationalist approaches to learning. And again, as we know, because we talked about this in the class on secularization, the expansion of the state, once the nation-state is created and it starts to expand and takes on more and more functions for itself, it ultimately takes on many of the social functions, i.e. education, health, welfare, so on, that were provided by religious organisations. And this led in Western Europe to the development of secular educational systems. However, all of that said, this is the final point on the historical global review bit, by the way, and then we get onto stuff that is sort of maybe more interesting for the actual debate at least. Religious institutions continue to play a significant role in education systems around the world, and this is particularly the case in non-Western societies. So, for example, madrasas, Islamic schools, continue to provide the main source of education in many Muslim-majority countries. This is sometimes seen as a source of we can talk about this in the seminars, a source of potential instability and problems. In Pakistan, for example, there has over the past 2 to 3 decades been an explosion of madrasas throughout the country, such that the government doesn't know how many there are, and this has led to lots of arguments around radicalisation and promoting extremism, because largely a lot of these madrasas won't teach anything but religion. This is like the only thing that they will do, and they'll have a very, very particular view of how that religion should be interpreted. The Catholic school is the primary education provider in Africa. Around 90% of all primary school children in Africa will attend a Catholic school, and it also has a huge role to play in Latin America. In India as well, for example, religious traditions have had a key role in providing education for centuries, continue to provide many schools and universities run by Hindu, Muslim, Christian and Sikh organisations. In the UK, the debate around the role of religion in the education system centres on a thing called faith schools, which I'm sure everybody in this room has heard of. This is a slightly misleading phrase, because the term faith school is not a legal term. It's a term that's used to refer to schools of an explicitly religious character. That's the legal phraseology. But it's the term that everybody uses, right? So we talk about faith schools even though there is actually no legal definition and that's not the legal terminology. Faith schools were introduced by the new Labour governments, led by Tony Blair, and they were justified on the grounds of fairness, choice, and diversity. And so a key argument here was that if Christian and Jewish schools were permitted, which they were, then it seemed sort of incongruous and, anomalous and unfair to say that you couldn't have Hindu schools or Sikh schools or Muslim schools. There's no obvious reason to exclude other religious communities from having their own schools when Christians and Jewish people had theirs. So this was one of the arguments for expanding schools across different religious traditions. As of 2023, so admittedly these figures are a couple of years out of date. Good luck trying to find the right figures from the Department of Education website, by the way. If you managed to do that, let me know where you found it, because I've tried and failed on several occasions to navigate that particular mess. But these are, the figures won't have changed too much. So these are the figures from 2003. There were just over 6,800 state-funded faith schools in England. The vast majority over 90% of these were primary schools, so this was 6,200-ish, and this accounted for 37% of all primary schools in England were faith schools, and 18% of all secondary schools were faith schools. I am just going to take a slight detour at this point, so this is a bit of a sidebar, but if you are doing this topic for any of your assessments, and you want to go and find, obviously there's the reading list that's got stuff on it, right? But if you want to go and do research beyond the reading list, get some evidence, just wander around the debate or whatever, and you're wondering where to start, I would go straight to the Faith Schools Research Bank. Now, admittedly, this is organised and hosted by the National Secular Society, so they have a particular angle on faith schools, right? Which is that, surprise, surprise, they don't like them. But the reason why I like this research bank is because I put it together. And I was very keen at the time when I was working with the Secular Society to do this, and I was like, look, if we find stuff and it's pro-faith schools, we're not leaving it out because, I'm not here to promote a particular thing or, have an ideology or whatever, right? I'm here to find the evidence and present the evidence. And if we're going to build this thing, it's going to have to be whatever turns up, turns up. And we didn't know what was going to turn up because, we hadn't looked at it, right? And they were like, that's fine, do that. So we did it. And, you can find in the research bank, it will have stuff that's favourable to faith schools and stuff that's unfavourable to faith schools. And it's all nicely catalogued and laid out. It was also put together, by the way, I have to say this. It wasn't just me. There was my colleague, Rebecca Vernon, also helped put it together, who was a student on this module at the time, and she did some work on faith schools, and then they asked me to do this, and I didn't have the time to do it, so I asked if anyone else wanted to do it, and Rebecca said she would do it. So we worked on this and put it together. It's the biggest repository of information on faith schools in the country, right? We used over 200 academic articles, and since we put it together, it's since expanded. It's got third-party reports, it's got opinion polls, it's got a whole bunch of stuff in there. There are other data sets you can use just to flag this up. The Accord Coalition have got one. British Humanists have got one. Theirs are bigger, but they include other stuff that's not just about faith schools, right? So they'll include things about, religious education and so on. So if you're just looking for a database on faith schools, ours is the biggest, and I'm not saying it's the best, but it's in the top one. So that's where you should go first of all for this. Okay, on to the evidence. So I'm going to run through some of the main arguments, essentially for and against faith schools, or rather the other way around, against and then for faith schools, and then there's a bit of a summary at the end. So, first of all, the case against faith schools. The first argument that tends to come up in debates here is that faith schools are indoctrinatory. According to critics, a central function of a faith school is to promote a particular religion or a particular set of religious beliefs or a religious worldview, however you want to describe it. And the problem here is that religious beliefs are unverifiable. And because they can't be shown to be true, you can't empirically prove any particular religious worldview as being true, they can only be passed on by using psychological means like charm or intimidation or something like this. And effectively, this amounts to indoctrination. And this doesn't even, by the way, need to be overt, right? You don't need to have somebody turning up every day and saying, this is what you have to think, It will be enough to have, there's subtle forms of indoctrination, right? If you're going into school every day and you've got religious posters on the wall and you have to walk past them, you've got a mural or something which says God saves, and you have to you see that on a daily basis, that has a drip, drip, drip effect over the time that a person is at school. And critics say this is especially pernicious in the case of schools, firstly, because children lack the cognitive skills and maturity that they need to make informed judgments about religious claims. can't weigh up the pros and cons and all the different alternatives, and they don't know enough about life, don't have the intellectual development to do it. Secondly, because beliefs that are held non-rationally are inherently difficult to change. The discovery of counter-evidence, once somebody absorbs information, or they come to a particular belief, if they acquire that belief through non-rational means, it's really difficult for them to shift it. Even when they're presented with counter-evidence, like empirical evidence, if they've been indoctrinated into a particular belief, then it becomes really hard to shift later on in life. And thirdly, critics will argue that indoctrination excuse me, is the very antithesis of education. So the purpose of education is to teach facts, to teach people the ability to think critically about those facts, to analyse things and so on. Teaching faith, according to critics, is not an educational task. So all of this is problem one. Excuse me. A second issue here is the case of children's rights. And critics claim here that promoting a particular religious worldview undermines the autonomy of children, i.e. the right for them to be free from having beliefs foisted upon them at an early age until they're old enough, to think through things for themselves and then reach their own decisions. And we rightly impose limits on what parents can do to their children, right? You can't sell them, you can't use violence, the whole bunch of things, right? You can't give them drugs and everything else. So all of these would be obvious and very, very good things, good limits on all of this. Critics then will say, well, why is it then acceptable for parents to decide what kinds of ideas go into a child's head? And a related argument here is that faith schools can also lead to children being labelled according to their parents' beliefs. So it's not uncommon, for example, to hear children being described as, Catholic children or Muslim children, for example. The problem with this is immediately apparent when you swap out the religious labels for, let's say, economic or social or political labels, for example, right? You wouldn't call children neoliberal children. I mean, it's obviously, or Marxist children, right? You wouldn't describe children as anarchists, even though, as anyone who's ever had children will know, they are naturally anarchists from day one. In this case, it would be silly, right? So why then do critics say, is it acceptable to describe children according to their parents' religious beliefs when, this is, arguably, and again, we've touched upon this before as well, religion is the most important thing that you can decide in your life. This is the future of, this is the nature of reality, the future perhaps of your eternal soul and everything else. It's a bit more important than whether or not you agree with Milton Friedman and his quantity theory of money, right? That's not quite on the same level as, what's going to happen to you for the rest of eternity. So, why is that okay when we would naturally think the other stuff is absurd? A third criticism from critics, is that faith schools are discriminatory. And at this point, I have to take a very, very short, as you can see here, this is a bit of a mouthful. There is a sort of technical distinction that just needs to be made at this point, right? And I apologise for this. I was in two minds whether to leave this bit in or take it out just because it kind of bogs things down a little bit, but it's worth just running through it very quickly. One of the complications here is that there are different types of schools, right? We have free schools, we have academies, we have voluntary aided schools, we have voluntary controlled schools, etc., etc., etc. And they all have different kind of levels of, powers and abilities and different setups and everything else. Two of the main ones I'm just going to mention here is the distinction between voluntary aided and voluntary controlled schools. Voluntary aided schools are where the religious body owns the land and the buildings, and the state will pay the running cost of the school and 90% of all the capital costs and the maintenance and so on. But the school basically runs itself, right? The governing body employs the staff. They have much more freedom to do things religiously, as I'll come on to in just a second. Voluntary controlled schools are where the religious organisation might own the buildings but not the land. the state funds the school completely and the local authority employs the staff. So there's a technical distinction between the two. And this is significant because when it comes to issues of discrimination, you get sort of different outcomes. So one of the things that critics point out here is that faith schools can be discriminatory in various different ways. They have exemptions from equalities legislation when it comes to protected characteristics. If you remember that we were talking about last week, you can't discriminate against people on the basis of age or gender or sexual orientation or religion or belief, except you can in some cases. And faith schools are one of those cases. So faith schools can use a religious test when they're employing their staff, and in the case of voluntary controlled schools, it's up to 20% of the staff can be chosen because they're a member of that religion, including the head teacher. And in voluntary assisted schools, it goes up to 100%. And there's a similar case when it comes to selecting students. So new free schools, so if you set up a school and you want to call it a free school, now you can select 50% of your students on the basis of your religion if your school is oversubscribed. So let's say you've got 1,000 places, you have 2,000 applicants, you can then take 50% of your school places and give them solely to people who follow your religion. Right? The other 50% have to go to everywhere else, but 50% you can have for your own religion. Voluntary aided schools can select up to 100% on the basis of their religion. And so critics, will look at this and say this is just profoundly unfair. But on grounds of employing people on the basis of their religion, and secondly, because you're selecting children on the basis, again, to follow the argument, because of the labelling stuff, not of their religion, because they don't already have one, but their parents' religion. And this is, extremely unfair. Fourthly, critics will also say that faith schools are divisive and foster intolerance. Firstly, because it divides children on... but when you start dividing children on religious grounds, you very often then, because these things intersect, end up discriminating or dividing children on socio-economic and ethnic grounds. Two things are obviously religion and ethnicity and so on are not the same, but they do tend to overlap in a lot of cases. We can see here some figures. This is from a piece of research by the ICOCO Foundation and others, was looking at the extent of ethnic segregation in schools and found that, as you can see, 64% of non-Christian secondary schools undersampled the white British students in their particular area according to what they... If everyone was taking an equal amount, this is what you would expect to find, right? 64% of non-Christian secondary schools undersampled. The average across the country was 13%. And in the same piece of research, they were looking at schools and deciding whether or not they were segregatory on the basis, again, of the mix in their area and whether they took a mix that was reflective of their constituency. And they found that just under 29% essentially of primary schools that were faith schools were segregatory compared to about 25% of non-faith schools. So that's one area that critics will point to and say, yeah, they tend to end up with these ethnic clumping effects across schools. But we also have a couple of other areas. One is that the claim is that faith schools promote prejudice and discrimination. For example, by encouraging negative attitudes towards people of other faiths, or by promoting negative attitudes towards sexual minorities, for instance. And then finally, the argument is that faith schools promote a sense of insularity because they have a sense of, again, which is something that's come up during the course of the module, this idea that religion promotes in-group, in- and out-group mentalities. And so it promotes bonding social capital because you're clumping people of the same religion together, and then it doesn't promote or it undermines bridging social capital. And this is obviously bad for community cohesion, bad for the well-being of a liberal, multicultural society. So those are some of the main arguments against faith schools, right? Those are, I think, are probably the four biggest ones. Supporters of faith schools argue that faith schools are, on the contrary, faith schools are in fact beneficial to individuals and society and communities in lots of different ways. And I'm going to give you 8 of them. So, for those of you who like lists, or for those of you who want to count down because you can't wait to get to the end. So, 1 of 8. Supporters of faith schools argue that, and a lot of these, by the way, are taking issue with some of the points I've just raised, right? So there's a few sort of rebuttals mixed up in here. First of all, supporters argue that faith schools do not, in fact, indoctrinate their pupils. It's true that some faith schools, particularly faith schools belonging to minority religions, will emphasise a particular faith, largely because they're trying to pass on, in the case of Jewish schools, for example, the whole point of having Jewish schools is to pass on a cultural identity. So you do get a bit of that, right? It's true. But supporters claim that most faith schools are about instilling an ethos or a set of religiously inspired values rather than promoting a particular religious belief. Let me give you an example of this. This is randomly selected from the list of top schools on the Ofsted website, which nicely lists them according to whether they're religiously oriented or not. This was one of the religious ones. As you can see, the Bolton Muslims Girls' School makes the point quite nicely. This is from their website, which says that they aim to promote an Islamic ethos, which is embedded throughout the school, the curriculum, and everything else. So supporters of faith schools will say, these schools are not trying to indoctrinate students into a particular religious worldview. They're trying to promote a particular ethos inspired by religious values. Supporters also point out that many children leave faith schools without having a religious belief. I mean, Richard Dawkins went to a faith school. There you go. It's not necessarily the case that if you go to one, you're going to turn out to be religious, right? Quite a lot of people go to faith schools and don't end up having religious beliefs. And they also point out that, most teachers are not concerned with passing on religious beliefs. This is certainly true. I know quite a few teachers. Most of them just want to get through the day, right? Go to work, do the stuff, go home, have that. It's not like a maths teacher is waking up in the morning going, how can I use my lesson on trigonometry to promote the word of the Lord, right? It's absurd, It's not how it happens. And supporters of faith schools will say teachers don't actually, you might get 1 or 2, but on the whole, teachers don't want to turn up to promote their religious views. Thirdly, is taking issue with the idea that, this was the point about indoctrination, right? That, there's no hard empirical evidence that will prove religion, so therefore it's only passed on by indoctrination. Well, supporters of faith schools say, look, we get taught lots of things without direct empirical evidence. Why is that the criteria here? Things like abstract maths, right? Or geometry, or philosophy. There are whole departments in universities around philosophy or political theory, you'll know that from political theory classes. Lots of this stuff you can't empirically measure, So that's one issue. Supporters also say, in fact, it's wholly impractical to insist that we don't take things on trust. There are a whole bunch of reasons why it's good to take things on trust. If you're watching a TV show and Professor Brian Cox starts telling you about black holes or stars, you don't think to yourself, that's interesting, I'm going to rush out and get a degree in quantum physics in order to verify what he said. You'll take it out, okay, he's a professor in this area, there's a whole field of peer review, this is how journals work, this is how scientific research operates. If they've arrived at this conclusion, there's a pretty good chance they know what they're talking about, right? We take it on trust, and we have to take things on trust, just because you don't have the time or the energy or the intellectual capacity to do everything for yourself. Fourthly, supporters of faith schools also point out that there's no agreement on what education actually is, and that education is something that is socially constructed. So when critics say that education should be about facts and critical thinking, and that teaching about religious faith is wrong, well, isn't this something that communities should decide for themselves? Who made these critics of faith schools the arbiter of what counts as valid education. This is something that's open for debate. In relation to this, supporters also point out that parents do have the right to educate their children in their own faith. This is enshrined in the UN Declaration on Human Rights, the Universal Declaration, which we talked about last week, which says, as you can see here, parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. If you want to start unpicking the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, I mean, that's not a particularly, that's not a thread that I would like to pick up, because other people with perhaps more nefarious ends would want to join in and rewrite it, for themselves. So that could be a problem. And what's wrong with parental choice? Anyway, there are lots of things that we don't allow children to decide for themselves, right? If children were allowed to take their own path in life, most of them probably wouldn't go to school at all. They'd live on junk food. And if they were forced to go to school, they would just take the easiest subjects. They'd like, ideally, to spend all day sitting around playing FIFA on the Xbox or whatever it is, Minecraft or something, right? Or just mindlessly scrolling on TikTok. We don't let kids decide things for themselves for very good reasons. So why is it that parental choice is seen to be such a problem in this situation? Okay, argument number 6 on this theme. Supporters also claim that providing children with insights into their distinctive faith traditions, and this is particularly the case, by the way, for minority groups, can enhance rather than reduce their autonomy. One view here is that identities can only be established through being a member of a group or being part of a community or having an identity that's connected to something that's larger than yourself. And so by developing and cultivating this, faith schools allow children to be aware of their own particular faith tradition and will teach them about their own particular cultural heritage. And this, they argue, is a good thing, because children who grow up feeling secure in their own culture will end up feeling more confident, more secure in their own sense of well-being, their own identity. They'll grow up to become more well-rounded citizens, thereby aiding social cohesion and the well-being of society as a whole. So the critics' argument is that faith schools will undermine social cohesion through segregation and clumping and everything else and creating in and out groups. The counter-argument from supporters is actually no, they create well-rounded, secure citizens with a well-rooted sense of their own identity, and that is actually what you need for a well-functioning society. Penultimately, on the basis of all of this, supporters will further claim that faith schools are good for promoting tolerance and social cohesion. One reason for this is that faith schools will help to integrate minority groups into the life of the nation. So for a really good example of this, for example, is when the British state began providing subsidies for Catholic schools. And this then helped to encourage the integration of Catholics into British society, which aided the ultimate amount of social cohesion. And you could make the same case for Muslims, for example, or Hindus or Sikhs, and so on. And it's further argued on this point, by the way, that faith schools don't create segregation, which is one of the criticisms that the critics like to make, that they divide people up. Well, the supporters say, no, faith schools don't create segregation. Faith schools are largely a product of divisions that already exist in society. Northern Ireland being a case in point, right? With the separate Catholic and Protestant schools in Northern Ireland did not cause the troubles in Northern Ireland. They are a product of a divided society rather than the cause of it. And finally, this is a big point in capital letters, right, and flashing lights. This is one of the biggest points in the entire debate around faith schools, which is that faith schools get superior educational outcomes, i.e. grades, than compared to non-faith schools. And the argument here from supporters is usually that these better grades are a direct result of the religious ethos of that school and the way in which the school is run and everything else. And this is supported by a fair amount of empirical evidence. So let me just give you one little bit. These are Attainment 8 scores from 2024. This is the average score for the top 8 GCSEs. And as you can see, the Attainment 8 scores for faith schools was higher than for non-faith schools by about 3 percentage points. And there's a similar gap as well, as you can see here, for GCSE grades 9 to 5 in English and maths. And state-funded faith schools get better grades than non-faith schools. There is an educational gap here, right? Faith schools do get better grades than non-faith schools, on average. And again, I'm not going to bombard you with loads of stats here. I'm just going to, at this point, I'll just redirect you to the Faith Schools data bank. There'll be lots of stuff in there. You can go and have a wander around and see what you can find. So those are the arguments for and against. So what do we make of all this? Well, there's 4 things I want to just sort of focus on and run over as a way of trying to wrap it all up. I'm not going to go through over all of these points. But the first, which I think is worth noting, is the issue that, or the claim that faith schools provide greater choice, right? If you remember, this was one of the initial justifications that was used by the new Labour government to, when they were bringing faith schools in. And, well, is this true? Do faith schools improve parental choice? I mean, on an aggregate level, it would look like it. If you've got more schools from different religions, then obviously this increases the overall diversity of the education sector. So you can say, by default, there is more choice. However, your ability to access this diversity depends very much on where you live. And this is where the problem starts to come in, because around about 30% of people in England live in an area where their closest school is a faith school. And the proportion, if you live in rural areas, is even higher, right? More than half of all primary schools in rural areas are faith schools. Often it's the only school in the village. So if you live in one of these locations and you don't want to send your child to a faith school, or you want to send your child to a school of a different religion, you have a problem, right? Effectively, you're forced to send your child to that particular school, or make arrangements to go miles out of your way every single day to drop your child off, if you can even get into that particular school, because it's probably outside your catchment area and everything else, right? So there are huge issues around choice. And just because on the total level, the diversity has gone up, this doesn't actually mean that when you drill down into the individual level, everyone has access to this diversity, because it simply isn't true. So that's the first thing I wanted to just run over. Secondly, it's also interesting that this idea of choice doesn't seem to be a choice that most people want to have. When you look at opinion polls on attitude towards faith schools, and this, one of the strange things here, by the way, is these are some of the most recent ones I could find. It's not like you get opinion polls being taken every other month, right? Or even every other year. They don't seem to roll around very often. But when they do, they show that actually a significant proportion of the population is opposed to faith schools. As you can see here, a YouGov poll in 2017, almost half of people said they did not support state-funded faith schools. Just 29% were in favour, and the rest were obviously, I have no idea. An interesting poll from Populus in 2016 found that 73% of people opposed selection on religious grounds. And this was also true for majorities of religious groups that were also polled in this sample, right? 69% of Catholics, of Church of England members said they didn't want selection on religious grounds. 63% of Catholics, 82% of Muslims, 82% of Hindus as well. The third point that I wanted to quickly look at is the issue of academic grades. Because it's true that faith schools do tend to get better grades than non-faith schools. And that's something that obviously, needs to be explained, right? And supporters will say this is evidence that faith schools are good. Critics, though, will say, well, this is one of the things that comes up here in the debate. And And it's the issue of selection. So the criticism here is that faith schools will select the brightest and least disadvantaged children in their particular area, and this explains the gap in educational attainment. It's because they're bringing in children who have higher levels of educational attainment already, probably come from more middle-class backgrounds, whose parents value education, who have the time and the resources to spend on their children's education, internet access, buying books and so on, whereas working-class families might not have that to the same level. And so it's this which ultimately feeds through to the educational outcomes, not the ethos and the values necessarily of the school. And figures show this in two key areas. There's also quite a lot of data on this. The two main proxy indicators of whether or not a child is disadvantaged or comes from a particularly disadvantaged part of society is measures of free school meals and special educational needs. And on both of these scores, faith schools do worse than non-faith schools on average. So as you can see here, these are figures taken in 2016. Just 12% of faith schools, I think this is if I've got this figure the right way around, 12% of children in faith schools are eligible for free school meals. In non-faith schools, it was 18%. We get a gap, smaller gap, but still a gap in secondary schools. 12.6% of children in faith schools eligible for free school meals. In non-faith schools, it was 14%. And it's the same pattern, as you can see here, for special educational needs. Which I won't run through the statistics because, you've all got eyes and you can read them for yourself. Now, one of the accusations here then from critics of faith schools is that they're engaging in a process called cream skimming, which is where faith schools, through overt or covert means, whether or not they're if you have like an interview to get into a faith school, they might kind of, ask questions to find out your socioeconomic background, or they might ask questions on, the questionnaire you might have to fill in to apply for a faith school, or something like this, right? That they're trying to find out the educational background of children, and then they're picking the children that essentially are more likely to get better grades. So cream skimming, deliberately excluding children from more disadvantaged backgrounds. That's what the critics will typically say. On the other hand, it could be a case of self-selection on the part of parents. And I think this is a really interesting argument because I'm not entirely sure how you would work this out one way or the other, right? It could be the case that let's say you have a faith school in a particular area and that particular area attracts, the school starts getting good grades, so more middle class parents move into the area so they can get a place for their children in that school. So, property prices go up and all that kind of stuff. So their school then starts to attract middle-class parents. The character of the school becomes increasingly middle class. After a while, it's possible that the culture of that school will also become more middle class to the extent that working-class families in that area might choose not to send their children to that school, either because they think they won't get in, so it's pointless even applying, or they might think that if they do get in, their child won't fit in, right? And maybe there's another school nearby with a more working class culture and, more working class children. I'll just send my child there, right? They'll have less, make more friends and all the rest of it, right? Maybe it's something like that. So this could be a process of self-selection on the part of parents rather than cream skimming on the part of faith schools. The final thing I'm going to mention here is that, sorry, I'm going to skip through my slides. We've already done this. Yes. The long-term impact of faith schools is not very well known. And it's quite tricky, right? Because how do you measure the ethos of a school? You'd have to take a longitudinal study and you'd have to sort of presumably measure people's values when they went into the school. You'd have to measure the values when they came out of the school to see if there was a gap. You'd then have to measure their values throughout their life to see if those values have continued or whatever, right? You'd have to do a long-term study into this. And that's quite tricky. The only study that I'm aware of that has done anything like this, if you find others, please let me know, is by McKendrick and Walker. And they looked at 8,000 pupils from between the ages of 14 to 25. And what they found was that there were some benefits for educational outcomes at GCSE level. So if people with higher levels of religiosity at GCSE level tended to score a third of an extra pass higher than children without religiosity or with lower levels of religiosity, right? So there's not a huge gap, but there was something there, right? People with higher levels of religion got slightly better grades than people without. However, the study also found that this had largely disappeared, by the way, by the time people get to university, so that kind of effect has disappeared. But they also found that it was the individual beliefs of the pupils themselves, rather than the institutions that they attended, that had the effect. It was religiosity, not faith schools, that had the educational benefits. As you can see here, this is expressed in the particular quote. But that's it, right? I mean, one longitudinal study, we obviously need more to sort of, get more data on this. But there we are. That's it from me for today. Thanks for coming. Have a good reading week. That's all I'm contractually obliged to say to you today. So I'll see you next time out.